Evan, you're going to tell us a lot about the Emancipation Proclamation, and Evan, it is your thing.
Hello, everybody. I will be talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, precursors and incursions. In other words, backstory and some movements into the South. How did I get interested in this? Well, of course, I had something about it in high school and junior high, but not much depth. And part of it was I tried to figure out the logistics of how the North would get into the South and get the people they need for troops. Some of it turned out to be fairly straightforward, but it always seemed like a mystery to me. So some of the topics will be slavery and abolition, of course. I'll talk a little bit about Antietam, how that fit in. Lincoln and his appeals and the opposition to him. Plantations that got deserted. And the United States Colored Infantry, as they were called, USCI. Going back a little bit before the Civil War, 1847 and into the 50s, in Washington, D.C., there was a population of 40,000 people, and that included several thousand slaves. Some of the luminaries that were still in Congress at this time were John Quincy Adams, Daniel Webster, and John Calhoun. Of course, there were debates on slavery and the Missouri Compromise. Precursors. Talk a little bit about Lincoln's views on slavery, which did change a bit. In the 1830s, the Illinois legislature dissented on a resolution in Illinois to form abolitionist societies, considering slaves to be property, and feeling that the resolution was would have endorsed slavery. Lincoln's parents were anti-slavery. Moved to India. The gradual extinction. People thought that they were.
You need to mute.
They thought there would be a gradual.
All right, we're good now.
Okay. So some people thought there would be a gradual extinction of slavery with all the laws being passed. Around 1848, there was actually a drafted proposal for emancipation in the capital city. This would allow government funds to compensate for slaves' value. And slaveholding states' government officials could bring servants on business trips. And it would provide for arrest and return of fugitive slaves. But the bill was never introduced. There was an atmosphere of divisiveness and a fear of national abolition. There's Lincoln, of course. His views in continuation. In the 1850s, he said the United States cannot be half slave and half free. He said this to an attorney. There was the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 supposedly stunned Lincoln. But now he wanted to go onward to stem slavery's spread. In other words, the Kansas-Nebraska Act would allow slavery north of 3630 latitude. And Lincoln, of course, debated with Douglas. They talked about the act and the expansion of slavery. Secretary of State William H. Seward was against a lot of this. And Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, they produced a lot of rhetoric, and at least one of them talked about higher laws or natural rights being involved in the discussion of abolition. And the plan was to readopt a declaration and pursue an anti-slavery movement. And continuing with views into the 1860s, in 1861, Confederate slaves supported troops. Confederate troops, that is, and the practice ended by confiscation law. Some slaves made it into Union lines, and Lincoln was very slow to formulate an opinion. And he would have to deal with a Republican Congress and so on. But he wanted to preserve the Union, as we're often told. So no abolition yet at this point. There was also an idea of colonizing freed slaves rather, but taking no extreme measures. One item of controversy was Frederick Douglass, who knew Lincoln. He was dismayed at the colonization plan. He didn't think that was the right way to do it. And also dismayed at a refusal to enlist blacks in the Union Army. 1862, August 14th, freed slaves were invited to the White House toward the idea of colonization in Central America and education. There were hostile reactions from Frederick Douglass, who didn't think this was the right thing, and Horace Greeley. And these were called fossil politicians, or at least there were some fossil politicians of the border states who were unduly influenced with Lincoln. He felt you cannot quell rebellion and uphold slavery at the same time, and was quoted, or at least paraphrased, in the New York Tribune. Lincoln felt that emancipation with military necessity was an answer. Save the Union, free all, some, or no slaves. Do more to help the cause and less if it hurts. Some of the things he said or has been paraphrased as saying. Okay, now to the meat of it, a snapshot of the Emancipation Proclamation. Here's some of the wording. Order and designate as the states and parts of states wherein the people thereof respectively are this day in rebellion against the United States. The following, to wit, and then there's a list of 10 states impacted. I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are, and henceforward shall be free. Such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. So he's looking to higher courts, you might say. Now, this applied only to slaves behind rebel lines, which is one of the things that's always fascinated me, the idea of the North and South being split, but the North is making a rule about the South. National government had protected slavery many times. Now, slavery was under its ban. Looking at December 1863 and the historical nature of the proclamation, we cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. Abe Lincoln Annual Message, December 63. I wanted to bring in Antietam a little bit. It does touch on this, and also we tend to talk a lot about the battlefields and so on. I thought it might be appropriate. The idea was to stop Lee's invasion. Of course, that didn't entirely happen, as we saw later with Gettysburg and so on. There was a military necessity to the proclamation. And Lincoln said, if my name ever goes into history, it is for this act. But it was about slaves in enemy territory, but not some of the border states like Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri. And this led to a lot of outrage by Southerners, anger among a lot of Northern conservative Democrats, joy among abolitionists, and a new support of the Union by the United Kingdom. So who will lead the way, they might have asked. Well, General John Pope, the new Army of Virginia, the Union, that is, not Confederate, according to a hopeful Lincoln. Somewhat aggressive, unlike McClellan, who did some stalling in his day, especially in August 62. The proclamation was read to former slaves in Sea Islands by federal agents in 62. And the first South Carolina volunteers under Higginson celebrated on their own and cheered to the skies, it is said. So there was McClellan, we all know. Now, he had failed in the Peninsular Campaign, thought the proclamation was premature, supposedly loyal to Lincoln, but that's a little bit questionable from what I've read. He was ordered to cross the Potomac, but did not move. He telegraphed the White House repeatedly and then crossed in late October. War became very abolitionist to McClellan. There were some philosophical differences between him and Lincoln. He was relieved of command in November 62 after Generals Buckingham and Burnside delivered the orders. Burnside was a successor to him, and then Hooker, Meade, and so on. Lincoln fired quite a few people until he got Grant. What were some of the reactions in 63 and 64? Well, there was a lot of opposition to the war in any case. Heartland Democrats were looking for armistice and a repeal of the proclamation. There was suspension of habeas corpus, which angered the peace Democrats. Habeas corpus is Latin for may you have the body. In other words, somebody could be held accountable without being there in person, without the body being there. And the Knights of the Golden Circle, sort of an origin of KKK and other groups, met in secret to try and end the war. And Jefferson Davis, as you might expect, was not very happy, and he called it the most execrable measure of guilty man. Seward in 62 made a reference to the government stretching out its hands to Ethiopia, this concept of the Black people. And Sherman in 64 had fear of capture or re-enslavement by guerrillas. That is something you might have to deal with once you get down there. So in 63, there were victories such as Gettysburg and Vicksburg, but these created false hopes in some ways. It was thought that there might be a quick end to the rebellion with all these Black troops being enlisted. Meade said to Lincoln in July 63, well, Lee has escaped me, crossed the Potomac into Maryland and to Virginia. Incursions, as in moving into the South. Here's a map, the blue border states or occupied ports. You can see that New Orleans has been captured down there in southern Louisiana on the Gulf. And the red states, of course, are the classic Confederacy, blue the border. And the checked ones are Union states or sympathizers in the West. Now, I looked at a book called Freedom by the Sword by Willie Doback, who was actually a friend of mine. He's since passed. But I wanted to take his views. Now, he did a lot of research. It's a very densely packed book. There's a lot of information in there, but I wanted to look at his take on things. And he noted that slaves fled to be with the Union in 62. There were not that many anti-slavery Union generals to raise Black regiments. There was still a lot of fear of alienated loyal Southerners. How far did they go was a common question. And Lincoln apocryphally said, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. There were divided ideas in the field on the proclamation recruiting plans. New York, for example, wanted diggers only, just to save white labor. So they didn't want to go all the way with a lot of Black troops, just Black diggers, because then white labor would be spared. So there were a lot of halfway measures or halfway thoughts. Lieutenant Colonel Halpine, South Carolina based, said, let them be between me and a bullet. General Sherman says something to the effect that soldiers or fighters don't mix the races. There was a Bull Run stampede. Shiloh gave bad memories and distrust of new formations of troops. Maybe we should use draftees. Blacks are not all keen to enlist anyway. So there were a lot of hedges, a lot of doubts about things. Continuing with Dobak's views, there were a lot of regional variations in what was done or what was thought. From the South Carolina islands, to the Mississippi Valley, colored troops abounded through 1863. In South Carolina, there were so-called Negro press gangs that hunted Confederates into the woods. So that was something of an embarrassment to some people. General Butler in Louisiana in 62 talked about largely Black soldiers, some descended from Andrew Jackson's 1815 service. So they had a history there, of course, the Battle of New Orleans or aftermath. So that was a positive thing for them, at least. In Tennessee, the 1st and 2nd Regiments of the United States Colored Infantry, USCI, despite District of Columbia precedents to raise troops, all the branches came to grow. All the branches of the military service. Troops were raised in Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Alabama, and at the edge of the Confederacy, LaGrange, Tennessee, and Natchez, Mississippi. Protection, which is one of the things I wondered about when I went into this, was provided by new posts that had been set up, in part at least, by Camp Nelson, Kentucky, and Port Hudson, Louisiana. Methods and procedures. There was friction among the Union officers. The free states wanted no impressment, no disturbance in local labor market. The occupied South had to do with competition over using Army quartermasters, engineering officers, the Navy, plantation owners, or lessees. So those are sources of people that could help. The all-white officers were preferred, so they wanted to avoid Black officer over white enlistee. They didn't want that kind of situation to come about. So they were still thinking in terms of white rule and Black takes orders. The War Department should improvise a force or a regiment, it was thought. This was seen as a gamble, not an experiment. So again, more doubts. There were some Black officers, though, and there were various steps to get a higher rank. Some enlistees pillaged or raided vegetable gardens to ward off scurvy. And at Beaufort, South Carolina, there were complaints of raids, also in Vicksburg and in Texas and Louisiana. So the South was definitely very well aware of this. I'm not sure what organs they complained through besides oral, but I imagine it showed up in some of their local papers. They saw through what was going on. And just for the record, there's a picture of the Beaufort house, which at one time people thought Sherman stayed in that, but it turned out he stayed elsewhere. This goes back to early 1800s at least. Now, Dobak talked about other human factors, and I put the H in red because there's so many H's here. I thought that was amazing. An era of knowing the winning versus the losing generals. We saw McClellan and so on. Halleck advised Grant in 1864 on officers who were fit for command. So Halleck was involved on the H's. Some white generals finished careers in the USCI areas regardless. So they stayed on in places where the Black soldiers had fought, but they finished their careers. So it didn't necessarily send them back north. Former Massachusetts governor N.P. Banks was defeated by Jackson in 1862. He was later in the Department of the Gulf, as Louisiana was often referred to, and he had several failures, such as the Red River Campaign. Hurlbut, another H, was a former Illinois politician, and he became a major general. He had a Memphis garrison. He was disliked by Sherman, and Hatch was under consideration as a commander, or H. General Hunter, H, twice did unauthorized Black enlistment, so people were not always playing by the rules. He was twice relieved of command, and he was an embarrassment to the Lincoln administration. But there were 101,000 Black officers and enlisted men on average in spring of 65, just as the war was ending. Almost 15% of the Union's total land force. So finishing up on Billback's account, Brigadier General Seymour was judged incompetent in the Fort Wagner assault of July 63, when the 54th Massachusetts, shown in the movie Glory, were underway. He was defeated at Olustee, Florida in February 64, relieved of command, sent to Virginia, captured by the Confederacy. The offensive and defensive actions by the colored troops went on despite frequent showing of garrison photos, riverine and coastal expeditions, and there were cavalry raids. So these things went on in spite of everything. Now within Ken Burns' book on the Civil War, there was an article by Barbara J. Fields who tries to talk about the actual freeing, or at least her take on how it really happened. So it wasn't just laws or words, of course. In Kentucky, some officials seized Tennessee and Alabama refugees who'd followed the Union Army northward. They were freed by the Confederate Confiscation Act and the Proclamation, but they were imprisoned and sold as slaves in Kentucky, where slavery was legal until the 13th Amendment was ratified in post-war 65. And ever since the 61 election, a lot of slaves felt our time has come. Government and slave agendas were united. There was no restored union without universal emancipation. One of Missouri's black soldiers, Spotswood Rice, said, "This whole government gives cheer," as it was spelled by him, "to me, and you cannot help yourself." And there was a picture that many of you have seen, I'm sure, many times before, of colored troops, a Library of Congress image. One that I've seen colorized, but not necessarily very well. Well, I mentioned the movie Glory, so I decided to title this slide Paths of Glory. These were incidents that were under fire. There were enlistments at the nearest federal garrison. Henry Powers and other slaves made it to Batesville and joined a USCI unit. Horses and mules were taken in 1864. In Dardanelle, Arkansas, in 1863, a slave by the name of John Aiken secretly organized about 60 men, but the Confederacy learned of it. So moving quickly, he later got more than 100 men from Yell County into the 11th. He became a company first sergeant before the war ended. 70 of the 108th USCI routed Confederate guerrillas in Kentucky with retaliations. Henderson-based recruiters cited, quote, from 40 to 60 men daily, unquote. And Adjutant General Thomas told the Secretary of War 14,000 black Kentuckians to join the Army. And there's a traditional painting of Fort Wagner, not necessarily the most accurate, but one that we've all seen before and can relate to in some way. Now, the 54th, of course, were from Massachusetts, so they weren't necessarily taking that many new people from the South. But there was a bit of an aftermath in South Carolina, and there were many laws coming into place. And they knew what the blacks knew of, or rather the North knew of the Jeff Davis Edict of December 1862, which would turn captured black soldiers over to the Confederacy. So there was that issue. In May of 63, there was an amendment. Black recruits and their white officers would be prosecuted and potentially executed as war criminals, court-martial. There was, going way back, there was a 1740 Negro Act after a Stono River slave rebellion, going way back. And this was cited in Confederate discussions of prisoners. So they didn't want a jury trial for blacks, not too surprising. Then there was General Order 252. Lincoln said there was no color distinction in the treatment of prisoners, or that's what he advocated. This was unknown to people like Hannah Johnson, who was a Buffalo-based daughter of a slave. And her son fought at Fort Wagner. So she made a private plea. So there are many little anecdotes like that going on. There was also an 1805 South Carolina law that commissioned officers would be insurrectionists. The 54th families, once they were informed, the Massachusetts 54th, that is, celebrated the General Order 252. And to go back a little more, there were other things going on in South Carolina. Some people feel that the first Southern Civil War, if not the first American Civil War, was such things as the battles of Kings Mountain and Cowtown. Some people like to say that was the Tories against the Patriots, or however you want to put it. A General Benjamin Lincoln, who's, I checked this, is supposedly not in Abraham's lineage, defended and lost Charlestown, which is now known as Charleston. He lost to General Clinton in 1780. Clinton wanted to free the Whig slaves, but return Royalist runaway to the Royalists. So there was this idea of freeing certain people and then returning them. So another sort of halfway measure. And it is said that a tidal wave of Black refugees resulted before this kind of thing. What were some of the consequences of the Massachusetts 54th Infantry? Well, at Fort Wagner, there were 4 Black captives. You see their names there: Council, Worthington, Kirk, and Harrison. And there was a trial, and one of them was from Missouri. A Charleston trial, and the Unionist attorney Mitchell offered defense to fight, despite the fact that the gallows was still being built, or was already being built, not to be subject to the Davis Edict nor Confederate congressional amendments. If they were born as slaves, they were legally freed by masters whose whereabouts were unknown. So they were trying in civilian court, or rather they were tried in civilian court as legitimate soldiers. So this was a minor victory for the attorney Mitchell. But there was a new Confederate resolution that supported actions of the executive toward Black troops. And more discussion went on, and that included Secretary of War Stanton. So what happened with the 4 Black soldiers? Well, Stanton deferred to Lincoln, was visited by Douglas and Kansas Senator Pomeroy. Lincoln stood behind 252 and the whole slavery question, but he admitted that unequal pay was wrong, that perhaps it should be the same pay for all, and wanted to smooth the way to victories. It could smooth the way to victories. They didn't stop and rectify that situation. Lincoln was to suspend prisoner exchanges November of '63. And South Carolina Governor Bonham vacated the matter and advised turning 4 back to the Confederate military. They may be slaves, but their masters are unidentifiable. So they ended up in the Charleston jail. Davis gave in 1865, allowing colorblind exchanges. At least 2 of them, Kirk and Council, and the other 2 died of typhus in South Carolina in early '65, not seeing the end of the war. And another 19 of the 54th, Massachusetts died in custody, including a Rochester friend of Frederick Douglass. So everybody has a slightly different story. Okay, in addition to the Emancipation Proclamation, there's also the 13th Amendment. Seward said we can't have it both ways. We can't end the war as soon as possible, push through with these extra troops, and abolish slavery with an amendment. Can't have it both ways. So which comes first? And what will Reconstruction, once we get to it, look like? 13th Amendment came in '65. Of course, Appomattox was able. Lincoln, of course, was assassinated in mid-April of '65, changing quite a few things. And Reconstruction was under Johnson and others until 1877. So abolishing slavery had its problems. Blacks were discussed as future voters, and a lot of people, know to be very prejudiced, worried that when we next, they're going to have blacks, we also going to have votes. There were various celebrations, and they varied by state or region. So sometimes it was April, August, January. Of course, in Galveston, the famous Juneteenth that we celebrate now. And they tended to wear yellow to celebrate. I'm not sure what the significance of that was, but that was the color they adapted. And Emancipation Day was sometimes known as the N-word day or Juneteenth. But there's still a lot of prejudice. Sure. I also found out in a dictionary of American Regional English, it's DARE, that a few people use the malaprop emancipated. So the word had not really gotten into some people as being freed. They connected it with something that sounded a little bit similar, and that's been attested at least in the 30s and 60s. So what are some of the legacies and losses? Well, in Boston, a Massachusetts regimental, or the Massachusetts regimental veterans got low-paying jobs. Some were denied voting rights. So even after their some victories and noble fighting, they were still second-class citizens. Some did become Buffalo soldiers, but they had a future out west. A lot of them were paid only at war's end, so like cash in hand. So if you didn't make it, you weren't paid. I also found a few stats. 178,000 plus blacks were equivalent to 1/12 of all the Union soldiers. There were 145 infantry regiments, 7 cavalry, 13 artillery groups, 1 engineering battalion. So some did get to do more practical or wood and iron based actions, help ramparts and so on. And 74% of the Northern blacks enlisted but had no citizenship. And these are some of the references I used. I did read most of Team of Rivals, but the film Lincoln, for those who don't already know, was only partly based on this, and it emphasizes the 13th Amendment rather than Proclamation. Billback's book, again, is Freedom by the Sword, and several others, including a book on the Revolution. So I've gone through this fairly fast, but it's time for questions and answers, which I will try to ask or try to answer. But I stress that there are a lot of stats here, and I probably won't know some of them right off the top of my head. I'll try to answer questions you might have at this point.
Are there any questions online? Any questions in the room? If you are on Zoom and you are muted, you are free to unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment, anything to say.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What are fossil politicians
Oh,
from the border states? Which side were they on?
I think those were I think there were people who probably in league with thinking accountant, people like that. Either that generation or the intermediate generation.
Just never had heard that term.
Yeah. It kind of surprised me too.
Did your studies of 54th Massachusetts tell you where they enlisted from? Because they didn't have enough freed blacks in Massachusetts. Some of them were even Missouri.
I don't remember that offhand, but I know they did find a lot in South Carolina.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if there were many along the way. I'm not sure if they found some in Virginia or North Carolina. They were going down. Anyone else? But I did learn, in addition to all these anecdotes and laws and so on, that a lot of it was a matter of establishing ports or fortresses, compounds, south. I used to think in my mind, what were they doing? Were they going down south on the white flag and saying, you Southerners have to give up your slaves? But most of them got the word and ran and left their plantations. So sometimes the slaves were left. So they inadvertently gave in to their own people, the troops against them.
Was Sherman recruiting colored troops on his march?
You know, I'm not sure about that. Trying to think of where
I think they used some for labor.
they probably did. I decided not to really go too much into Sherman. I thought we'd
I think
be
Sherman
here
was
all night.
basically opposed to blacks in the military.
Yeah, he did have a lot of talents. Yeah.
Yeah.
But some people gave in. They just did the pragmatic thing.
He was happy to have them as ditch diggers, but
Yeah. Yeah.
not as rifle toting killers of Southerners.
Neil? Neil, better? Mike Devaney.
Yeah, Mike.
Um, if there is time, and I want to ask a question, and then I have something that I think would make our program quite relevant to the election situation that we're confronted with today. If there's time to present it, it's something I ran across recently. But what is the official date of the Emancipation Proclamation? Can somebody answer that? Are you able to hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Okay.
Well, it was certainly being worked on in 62. I seem to remember that January 63 was significant in some way. Either they had to wait for the new year to.
January 1st, New Year's Eve, that's why they wait.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course.
He announced it earlier, but
Right.
it would not take effect until January 1st,
Right.
1863.
And the ratification was a long process too, and that's
Yeah.
something that's still kind of boggles my mind, because the North is telling the South what to do when they're at war with each other.
This was an article that I'm not exactly sure where I ran across it, but I gave a little 4th of July gathering, and I use this as kind of an opener, and I think it's quite relevant. The author is a farm and food editor. His name is Alan Gubert, and he says, at the end of the road farm boy who grew up deep in southern Illinois, the 4th of July was more of a shade tree holiday from the alfalfa field than the noisy celebration of national independence. Besides, we were more partial to a local hero, Abraham Lincoln, than any frilly founding father. That leaning was confirmed a half century later, when on July 4th, 2021, I came across an essay by historian Ted Widmer that examined Lincoln's 1861 4th of July, his first as president. In the essay, Whitmer explained how one of Lincoln's first acts as president, his 6,200-word letter to Congress, calling it to Washington, D.C. for a special session, set the future stage for greatness. The bold act, just 4 months after his March 4th swearing in, Whitmer thinks, was Lincoln using democracy to save democracy by asking that the session meet on July 4th so that it might link every American to the Declaration of Independence and the memory of a country that began in a most idealistic way. Lincoln needed to act boldly. 6 southern states had left the Union and 4 more on the way. Also, Jefferson Davis, provisional president of the fast-forming Confederacy, had already been in office a month longer than Lincoln. More to the point, Lincoln knew that he was no Davis. His single 2-year term in Congress was no match for Davis's sterling career. West Point graduate, an officer in the Mexican-American War, former U.S. Senator, past Secretary of War, and former son-in-law to President Zachary Taylor. But Whitmer explains Lincoln possessed something Davis didn't, an expansive understanding of the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln believed that American freedom belonged to all Americans, including immigrants, and in fullness of time, he expected those freedoms to grow stronger and reach other people living in what he called the vast future. In other words, all Americans then and now were, as historians simply note, us. All that served as backdrop to the letter itself, a masterpiece in the way of a 4th of July oration, as it should be. Equally important, its principal arguments and classic Lincoln lyricisms hinted at the greatness yet to come in both his time in the White House and his historical timeliness. Lincoln, Whitmer says, argued that the war was essentially a people's contest and reminded Americans that democracy required a fundamental trust in others to work. And in language as relevant for today's red and blue politics, that a nation about to tip into blue and gray civil war, sort of technical there. If discontented individuals attacked the government every time they lost an election with false sophisms, misleading arguments, and other ways of drugging the public mind, it would put an end to democracy everywhere. To ensure that all Americans, North and South, got this meeting, Lincoln added a punchline. When the ballots have been fairly and constitutionally decided, there can be no appeal back to bullets. The letter was a triumph. As members of Congress listened, Whitmer writes, they often broke into applause, stunned that their new president had found a language so compelling. Later that same day, after reviewing Union troops on Pennsylvania Avenue, Lincoln hoisted a flag himself to the top of a tall flagpole. Afterward, soldiers did the same thing. The papers reported that the Declaration was read over and over again throughout soldiers' camps. One Army regiment's leader, however, asked the new president to speak. Lincoln deferred, Whitmer writes, by saying that the dignity of his position required that he say nothing at all for fear of misspeaking. But the historian reminds he had already spoken volumes. Through his message to Congress and his unwavering belief in the Declaration, the real fighting had not started yet, but the winning. The day Lincoln began, but by winning the day, Lincoln began to win the war. That's the end.
Thank you, Mike.
Well, maybe you'd like to present on this next time.
Well, it's about all I have, but I think it was powerful. And the thing that really struck me is how much Lincoln says here that is potentially relevant to our current political contest. I mean, I think history, as part of its goal, is to teach. We learn from our mistakes. I guess we learn best from our mistakes, if we should.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I also wanted to mention something that Stephen Stark shared with me by email. If you would like to read things from the Freedmen's Bureau,
Oh,
you might want to Google freedmen.umd.edu and then look at their various publications. They have a chronology and other works. So that's freedmen.umd.edu.
Other questions?
incidentally, this article apparently appeared in 2024, so it's relatively it's quite current.
Right?
Where did it appear?
Yeah, it appeared apparently in the writings of this farm and food journalist Alan Guebert, Guebert, and I haven't done a search on him, but he's an agricultural journalist and he has past columns available on 2024 AgCom. AG space COMM, all lowercase, at AgCom.
Any other questions or comments? Bill, would you give a short thing about what?
Oh, sure. You bet. I came prepared for that. Even can I just sit there?